The courtroom was cold, both in temperature and in the way people looked at Eleanor Whitmore. She stood at the defendant's table, her frail hands clutching the handle of an old, worn-out purse. Her gray hair was neatly pinned back, and though she dressed modestly, her clothes were clean and well-kept. Judge Martin Grayson peered down at her over his glasses. He was known for being strict, sometimes even ruthless in his courtroom. He believed in maintaining control, ensuring that cases ran efficiently, and showing no patience for what he deemed as wastes of time. Eleanor's case was a simple eviction hearing. The landlord, a shrewd businessman named Richard Calloway, had filed a case against her, claiming she had failed to pay rent for the last 3 months. The truth was, Eleanor had been living in that apartment for over 20 years, and until recently, she had always paid her rent on time. But life had not been kind to her in recent months. "My apologies, Your Honor," Eleanor spoke, her voice soft yet steady. "I have every intention of paying my rent, but I've been dealing with some financial hardships." Judge Grayson leaned back in his chair, smirking. "Mrs. Whitmore, do you think financial hardship is an excuse to break the law? If everyone who had money problems stopped paying rent, society would collapse." A few snickers echoed in the courtroom. The landlord's lawyer, a sharp-suited man with an arrogant smirk, took this as his cue. "Your Honor, the plaintiff has been more than generous in allowing Mrs. Whitmore time to make payments, but she has failed to do so. Mr. Calloway is simply exercising his legal right to reclaim his property." Eleanor tightened her grip on her purse. "I understand that, sir, but I only need a little more time. You see, my husband passed away last year, and—" Judge Grayson cut her off with a dismissive wave. "Mrs. Whitmore, this is not a charity. You either pay your rent or you leave. That's how the system works." The coldness in his tone sent a ripple of shame through Eleanor. She wasn't looking for pity, only fairness. "But, Your Honor," she continued, refusing to let her voice shake, "I have been trying. I had a job, but I lost it when I fell ill. I've been searching for work, but it's difficult at my age. Please, just a little more time." Judge Grayson chuckled, shaking his head. "Mrs. Whitmore, the law doesn't bend for sad stories. I'm ruling in favor of the plaintiff. You have 14 days to vacate the premises." Gasps echoed through the room. Eleanor's lips trembled, but she didn't argue. Instead, she reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. "I was hoping it wouldn't come to this," she said quietly. The judge barely looked at her. "What now, Mrs. Whitmore? Another excuse?" She took a deep breath and placed the envelope on the table. "No, Your Honor. Just the truth." The courtroom fell silent. Judge Grayson sighed and signaled for the bailiff to hand him the envelope. As he tore it open and scanned the document inside, his smirk slowly faded. Eleanor watched his expression change with quiet satisfaction. She had spent years preparing for this moment, even if she hadn't known it at the time. Judge Grayson cleared his throat. His hands trembled as he set the paper down. For the first time in his career, he was speechless. What is this?" he stammered. Eleanor folded her hands in front of her. "It's my credentials, Your Honor. You see, I am not just an elderly woman struggling to pay rent. I am a retired attorney, and not just any attorney. I was once your professor at law school." The entire courtroom gasped in shock. Judge Grayson's face drained of color. He blinked rapidly, his mind struggling to process what he had just heard. Eleanor smiled, but there was no malice in her expression, only quiet strength. "And if I remember correctly, Martin, I taught you everything you know about justice." A heavy silence filled the courtroom. Judge Martin Grayson sat motionless, gripping the document with trembling fingers. The confident smirk that had adorned his face just moments ago had disappeared, replaced by a pale expression of disbelief. Eleanor Whitmore, his former professor. The memory hit him like a tidal wave. Over 3 decades ago, he had been a law student at the prestigious Harlington Law School, struggling to make a name for himself in a fiercely competitive environment. And standing at the front of the lecture hall, commanding the respect of every student with her wisdom and sharp intellect, was none other than Professor Eleanor Whitmore. Judge Grayson swallowed hard. He had not heard that name in years, and yet, now she stood before him, not as the powerful legal mind he once admired, but as a poor woman on the verge of losing her home. Whispers filled the courtroom as spectators exchanged stunned glances. The plaintiff's lawyer, who had previously worn a smug smile, now looked uneasy, glancing between Eleanor and the judge. Even Richard Calloway, the wealthy landlord who had pushed for this eviction, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Eleanor let the silence linger before she spoke again. "I see you remember me now, Martin." Judge Grayson finally found his voice, though it was much weaker than before. "Professor Whitmore. I had no idea." Eleanor gave him a knowing smile. "Of course, you didn't. You never took the time to ask." He exhaled sharply, guilt creeping into his chest. He had dismissed her like she was nothing, like just another case on his docket, when in reality, she was one of the greatest legal minds he had ever known. The courtroom was still, waiting for his next move. But before he could respond, Eleanor took a step closer to the bench and continued. "You see, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady and commanding, "this case isn't just about rent. It's about justice. And if you truly learned anything from my teachings, you would know that the law is not just a set of rigid rules, it is meant to serve the people." Judge Grayson clenched his jaw. He felt the weight of every decision he had made in his career pressing down on him. How many times had he ruled against people without truly hearing them out? How many cases had he dismissed with cold efficiency, forgetting that real lives were at stake? He glanced back at the document in his hands. It wasn't just her credentials, it was a case file. Carefully, he read through it, his heart pounding as the truth unraveled before him. Eleanor had, in fact, been paying her rent all along. 3 months ago, she had sent multiple checks to the landlord's office, but the payments had never been processed. Instead, her landlord, Richard Calloway, had purposefully withheld them, waiting for an opportunity to evict her so he could renovate the apartment and charge triple the rent. It was a fraudulent eviction. Judge Grayson's grip on the paper tightened. His face burned with shame. He had nearly wrongfully evicted one of the most brilliant women he had ever known, all because he had been too blinded by arrogance to consider the possibility of injustice. Eleanor met his gaze. "Now, tell me, Your Honor. What does the law say about landlords who file false claims in court?" Judge Grayson took a deep breath and turned to Richard Calloway. His eyes, once indifferent, were now filled with piercing scrutiny. "Mr. Calloway," he said, his voice cold and authoritative, "is it true that you deliberately withheld Mrs. Whitmore's rent payments in order to force an eviction?" Calloway shifted in his seat, suddenly looking uncomfortable. His lawyer whispered something urgently in his ear, but Calloway waved him off. "That's ridiculous," he scoffed. "Why would I do such a thing?" Judge Grayson narrowed his eyes. "Mrs. Whitmore provided copies of the checks she sent, each one matching the exact amount due. Yet, your financial records show no deposits made from her in the past 3 months. Either you are incredibly incompetent at managing your properties, or you've been lying to this court." A murmur spread through the crowd. The bailiff stepped closer, sensing the tension. Calloway's face reddened. I must have misplaced them. It was a simple clerical error." Eleanor shook her head. "A clerical error that just so happened to give you an excuse to evict a long-term tenant?" "I don't think so." Judge Grayson exhaled sharply, a deep sense of responsibility weighing down on him. "Mr. Calloway," he said firmly, "I find sufficient evidence to investigate your financial records. If it is proven that you knowingly withheld rent payments to commit wrongful eviction, you will face legal consequences." Calloway's mouth opened in protest, but before he could speak, Judge Grayson turned back to Eleanor. As for Mrs. Whitmore, he continued, his voice now laced with sincerity, this case is dismissed. She is not required to vacate her apartment, and furthermore, I will personally ensure that any fraudulent actions taken against her are brought to justice. A round of applause erupted in the courtroom. For the first time, Eleanor allowed herself a small, victorious smile. She had not come to court seeking pity, only fairness. And today, she had won. Judge Grayson let out a slow breath. He had started the day feeling powerful, in complete control of his courtroom. But now, he realized he had been taught a lesson. Eleanor Whitmore was not a helpless old woman. She was a fighter. A scholar. A woman of justice. And more than anything, she was his teacher, once again. The courtroom still buzzed with murmurs of shock and awe. Eleanor Whitmore remained standing at the defendant's table, her posture firm, her presence undeniable. Judge Martin Grayson sat at the bench, reeling from the weight of his actions. He had humiliated a woman who once shaped the very foundation of his legal career, dismissing her without thought, only to realize that she had been the one telling the truth all along. Richard Calloway, the landlord who had attempted to fraudulently evict her, looked pale. His lawyer whispered frantically in his ear, but Calloway was no longer smirking. He knew that the situation had turned against him. Judge Grayson turned to the bailiff. I want a full financial audit of Mr. Calloway's real estate transactions over the past 5 years. If we find evidence of fraudulent evictions, rent theft, or any other illegal activities, I will personally refer this case to the district attorney. Calloway bolted up from his chair. Your Honor, this is outrageous. You can't do this to me. Judge Grayson slammed his gavel down, silencing him. I can, and I will. You came into my courtroom today, thinking you could manipulate the law to suit your greed. But justice does not favor the wealthy, Mr. Calloway. It favors the truth. And today, the truth is not on your side. Calloway's lawyer hurriedly whispered something else, but it was clear, there was no escape. The damage was done. The judge had not only dismissed the case against Eleanor, but he had now turned his sights on investigating Calloway's entire operation. Eleanor remained quiet as she watched Calloway's face darken with realization. A part of her felt vindicated, not just for herself, but for all the tenants he had likely wronged before her. She had seen men like him before, men who viewed the law as a tool for profit rather than justice. But this time, he had lost. Judge Grayson took off his glasses and rubbed his temple. He had ruled on countless cases before, but this one would stay with him forever. He had learned something today, something far more valuable than any legal precedent. He turned back to Eleanor, his voice softer now. Mrs. Whitmore, I owe you an apology. Not just for my conduct today, but for underestimating you. I failed to do what I swore to uphold, to listen, to seek the truth, and to ensure justice is served. Eleanor met his gaze, and for a moment, he saw a flicker of something, pride, perhaps. The same pride he had seen in her eyes decades ago when she lectured in front of her students, instilling in them the belief that the law was a shield for the defenseless, not a weapon for the powerful. She gave him a small nod. I accept your apology, Martin. But remember this moment. Let it shape the way you judge future cases. His throat tightened. I will. Judge Grayson turned back to the courtroom. This case is dismissed. Mrs. Whitmore is allowed to remain in her residence, and an investigation into Mr. Calloway's practices will begin immediately. With one final slam of the gavel, the courtroom burst into chatter. The spectators whispered about the shocking turn of events. Some congratulated Eleanor as she gathered her things, but she only gave polite nods before turning to leave. Just as she reached the exit, she paused. Martin, she called out, looking over her shoulder. Judge Grayson looked up. I once told my students that the law is only as strong as those who uphold it, she said, her voice steady. Don't forget that again. And with that, she walked out, her dignity intact, her home secured, and justice served. Judge Grayson exhaled deeply as she left, knowing that he had just experienced a turning point in his life. Today, he hadn't just ruled on a case. He had been reminded of what justice truly meant. The end.